We didn't want them humiliating the distinguished guests at the VIP table. My sister-in-law Chloe announced this coldly, her lips curling into a perfectly glossed smirk as she took a delicate sip of her vintage champagne. I stood completely still in the center of the lavish $500,000 wedding reception. My eyes darted from the crystal chandeliers dripping from the ceiling and the towering imported floral centerpieces down to the dark, drafty corner near the swinging kitchen doors. There, seated at a flimsy plastic folding table that wobbled every time a waiter brushed past it, were my parents. My husband Julian did not even meet my gaze. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tight, as he scanned the room to see if anyone important was watching us. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging sharply into my skin. "Do not make a scene, Zuri," he hissed under his breath. "You are wearing a $3,000 dress bought with my doctor's salary. Keep your mouth shut and save my reputation in front of my boss." I looked at the man I had been married to for 8 years, a respected surgeon who was currently bowing down to a family of frauds. I marched straight to the DJ stand and took the microphone. By the next morning, the entire Sterling Empire fell apart. Their mansion was foreclosed, and my husband lost absolutely everything. My name is Zuri. I am 32 years old, and before I tell you exactly how I destroyed their fake high society world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind an arrogant family exactly who they are dealing with. The Sterling estate in Connecticut was supposed to be the epitome of old money elegance. Chloe had spared no expense for her wedding to Julian's younger brother Derek. The manicured lawns of their massive property were covered in white silk tents that billowed gently in the evening breeze. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of beluga caviar and glasses of $100 champagne. Everyone who was considered elite in the East Coast financial sector was seated at the massive VIP tables near the grand stage, laughing loudly and clinking crystal glasses. But as I walked through the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, the air in my lungs turned to ice. My father Thomas and my mother Helen were dressed in their absolute Sunday best. My father wore the sharp navy suit he had bought specifically for this occasion, a suit he wore with immense pride. My mother looked radiant in a tasteful emerald green gown she had spent weeks picking out. They had driven 4 hours in heavy traffic just to be here to support their son-in-law's family and celebrate love. Yet they were placed next to the industrial garbage bins. Every time the heavy kitchen doors swung open, the clatter of pots, the shouting of chefs, and the sharp smell of industrial dish soap washed over their small table. A waiter aggressively rushed past and accidentally bumped my father's chair, not even pausing to apologize as a soiled napkin fell onto my mother's pristine plate. Neither of them complained. They just sat there quietly, trying to make themselves as small as possible in a room full of people who looked right through them. I walked over to them, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, my vision going red. "Mom, Dad, what is going on here?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. My mother looked up and smiled, but I knew her well enough to see it did not reach her eyes. She patted my hand gently, her warm skin contrasting with the cold atmosphere of the room. "It is fine, baby," she said softly. "There was just a little mix-up with the seating chart. We do not mind at all. We have a great view of the kitchen staff working so hard. It reminds your father of his days sorting mail at the post office. We are just happy to be here for Derek and Chloe." My father nodded, trying to maintain his dignity, taking a slow sip of his water. But I saw the tightening of his jaw and the subtle lowering of his shoulders. They were protecting me. They had always protected me. They spent their entire lives working quietly, saving every penny, and building a foundation so I would never have to sit at the back of any room. And now my husband's new family was treating them like the help. I turned around and locked eyes with Chloe. She was standing near the towering ice sculpture at the main bar, surrounded by her wealthy bridesmaids, laughing loudly at something one of them said. I walked straight up to her, feeling the heavy silk of my dress swish around my legs with every purposeful stride. "Chloe," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through her shrill laughter. "Why are my parents sitting at a folding table next to the garbage?" Chloe sighed loudly, rolling her blue eyes and putting on a face of exaggerated, insulting pity. "Oh, Zuri, please do not start this drama right now. It is my wedding day. I am incredibly stressed. We simply ran out of space at the main tables. Plus, my father had to prioritize the managing partners from Vanguard and the state senators. We thought your parents would feel much more comfortable back there anyway. They are simple people, right? I mean, surrounded by all this generational wealth and old money, they might feel a bit out of place trying to figure out which fork to use for the caviar. We did them a favor." The casual racism and classist venom in her voice made my blood boil. She was looking at me the way she always did, like I was a charity case who had somehow managed to sneak into her exclusive country club. Before I could unleash the absolute fury building inside my chest, Julian appeared at my side. He was sweating despite the cool evening air, his eyes darting around nervously. He pulled me aside by my arm, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "What are you doing, Zuri? I am trying to network with Richard Sterling's golf buddies over by the cigar lounge. Do you know what kind of doors this family can open for my medical practice? The chief of surgery is sitting at table 1. I stared at Julian, utterly disgusted by the man standing in front of me. "Julian," I said slowly, emphasizing every word. "They put my parents next to the trash. Your wife's parents. Do you have absolutely no spine at all? Are you really going to let them disrespect my family just so you can rub elbows with some rich old men?" Julian sneered, his true colors finally bleeding through the polished doctor facade he wore so well. "Look, Zuri, your parents are retired postal workers and nurses. They do not fit in here, and you know it. Chloe's family is royalty in the financial world. You should be down on your knees, grateful we were even invited to the inner circle tonight. Now smooth your dress, put a smile on your face, and stop acting like you do not know how much I paid for that outfit. You are embarrassing me in front of the people who actually matter." I stood completely silent for a moment, letting his words sink in. He thought he owned me. He thought the surgical salary he constantly flaunted gave him the right to discard my family like garbage. He was a coward eager to trade his own dignity for a seat at a table of white elites who secretly despised him. He had no idea that I had quietly paid off his entire $250,000 medical school debt. He had no idea that the modest freelance consulting business I ran from my home office was actually the front for Apex Holding, a massive private equity firm. And he certainly had no idea that his precious wealthy Sterling family had secretly defaulted on all their commercial loans 3 years ago. Their entire empire was built on a mountain of debt, and I was the anonymous buyer who had just purchased every single one of their foreclosed assets. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress just exactly as he asked. But I was not calming down. I was preparing for a massacre. I turned away from my pathetic social climbing husband and looked toward the center of the room where Chloe's mother was currently holding court and laughing loudly. I decided right then and there that if the Sterlings wanted to play games with money, class, and power, I was going to show them what a real financial predator looked like. I reached into my designer clutch, my fingers sliding past my lipstick and wrapping around the cold, heavy metal of my black card. I walked directly past Julian, completely ignoring his frantic demands to come back, and headed straight for the banquet manager standing near the entrance. The Sterlings wanted a show about wealth to impress their guests. They were about to get a front row seat to the total collapse of their own fake empire. The banquet manager was a tall, stiff man named Gerard who was busy barking orders into a hidden earpiece. I marched directly into his personal space, my heels planting firmly on the marble floor. Before he could even offer his practiced, dismissive smile, I slapped my heavy matte black titanium American Express card directly onto his silver clipboard. The distinct clack of the solid metal caught his immediate attention. Gerard blinked, his eyes darting from my face down to the card. He recognized it instantly. It was the Centurion card, an invitation-only symbol of absolute unlimited financial power. I want to buy out the entire VIP seating area, I stated clearly, my voice carrying over the gentle hum of a string quartet playing in the background. I want every single table in that section cleared out right now, move my parents out of the garbage corner, and seat them exactly in the center of the room. Name your price to reorganize the floor plan, triple it for your inconvenience, and run this card. Gerard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his temple. The surrounding guests closest to us stopped their conversations. The clinking of crystal glasses ceased. A heavy, suffocating silence began to ripple outward from where I stood. Madam, I cannot simply displace the VIP guests. Gerard stammered, his professional composure cracking under the weight of the titanium card in front of him. This is a highly orchestrated seating arrangement approved by the Sterling family. Before I could tell Gerard that I had enough money to buy the entire catering company and fire him on the spot, a sharp, cloying scent of overwhelming floral perfume invaded my space. A manicured hand adorned with a massive, gaudy diamond ring reached out and rested patronizingly on my shoulder. It was Penelope Sterling, Chloe's mother. Penelope wore a silver designer gown that cost a small fortune, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed to project the image of effortless old money royalty. But up close, I could see the tight, desperate lines around her eyes. She smiled, but it was a cold, reptilian expression devoid of any actual warmth. Gerard, please excuse us. There seems to be a minor misunderstanding, Penelope purred, waving the manager away like he was a pesky insect. Penelope then turned her pale, icy eyes toward me. The crowd around us had subtly tightened their circle, pressing in closer to witness the drama. I could feel the suffocating weight of their stares, a sea of wealthy, entitled faces, looking at me as if I was a stray dog that had wandered into their pristine dining room. Zuri, dear Penelope, began, her voice dropping to a low, venomous whisper intended only for me and the immediate audience. Let us not make a spectacle of ourselves. We tried to be accommodating by inviting your family, but you must understand how these things work. Your parents are used to manual labor. Sitting near the kitchen might suit their familiar smells better. We did not want them to feel overwhelmed. I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her racism leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. She did not stop there. Vanguard High Society is not accustomed to people who mispronounce wine names or use the wrong forks. Penelope continued, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. We are protecting them from embarrassment. And quite frankly, we are protecting our esteemed guests from having to make awkward small talk with former postal workers. Put that silly piece of plastic away. I do not know whose card you stole or what credit limit you are trying to max out, but you cannot buy class. The air in the room felt impossibly thick. The subtle, polite racism that the Sterlings had always hidden behind closed doors was now being paraded proudly in the middle of the reception. They thought their white, old money status made them untouchable. They thought my black parents were beneath them simply because they worked honest jobs instead of manipulating hedge funds. Before I could completely destroy Penelope with the truth about her own bankrupt existence, Julian forcefully pushed his way through the crowd of onlookers. My husband was sweating profusely, his face flushed with panic and desperation. He had seen the commotion from across the room and sprinted over, terrified that his precious networking opportunities were being jeopardized. Julian did not ask me if I was okay. He did not ask what Penelope had said to me. Instead, he instantly bowed his head slightly to Chloe's mother, submitting to her authority without a second thought. Penelope, I am so incredibly sorry, Julian pleaded, his voice trembling with pathetic subservience. Please forgive her. She is just emotional today. She probably had too much champagne on an empty stomach. I will handle this immediately. Penelope offered Julian a tight, condescending smile, patting his arm, exactly the way one might pat a disobedient but useful pet. See that you do, Julian. We would hate for this little outburst to ruin your chances of securing that hospital promotion my husband promised to look into. The threat was clear, and Julian swallowed it whole. Penelope turned gracefully and glided back toward the VIP section, leaving me surrounded by judging eyes and a husband who had just sold out my family for a vague promise of a promotion. Julian grabbed my elbow, his grip bruising and desperate, pulling me into the shadow of a massive floral arrangement. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed, his teeth clenched tightly together. "Are you completely insane? Do you have any idea who these people are? That is the wife of a billionaire. She just insulted my parents." I shot back, my voice steady, despite the rage burning through my veins. "She said they smell like manual labor. She said they do not belong here, and you just stood there and apologized to her." Julian aggressively shook his head, refusing to hear the truth. "She is right, Zuri. Look around you. This is the top 1% of the country. They operate on a different level. Your parents do not know how to act in a place like this. And what is this nonsense about buying the VIP section? Put that fake black card away before you get us both arrested for fraud. You are an independent financial consultant. You do not have that kind of money." I looked into Julian's eyes and saw nothing but a hollow, desperate man. He was so blinded by his obsession with status that he was willing to let his own wife and in-laws be trampled. He hated where he came from, and he projected that hatred onto my parents. "You are ruining my life right now," Julian continued, his voice rising in panic as a few guests glanced our way. "Richard Sterling is best friends with the chief of surgery. If you embarrass his wife, my career is completely over. I need you to walk over to Penelope right now, look her in the eye, and beg for her forgiveness. You are going to apologize to her, and then you are going to apologize to Chloe. If you do not do this, Zuri, I swear to God I will walk out of this marriage tonight." He thought it was a threat. He thought the idea of losing him would break me and force me to submit to the Sterling's authority. He expected me to cry, to fold, to put my head down, and walk back to the garbage corner where they believed I belonged. The crowd of onlookers lingered just a few feet away, whispering behind their champagne glasses, waiting to see if the loud, out-of-place woman would finally be put in her place by her husband. The camera flashes from the wedding photographer illuminated the smug faces of Chloe's bridesmaids in the distance. The entire room felt like a suffocating cage designed to break my spirit and remind me of my supposed inferiority. But I did not feel broken. I felt liberated. Julian had just handed me the final piece of confirmation I needed. He had drawn his line in the sand, choosing a bankrupt family of bigots over the woman who had secretly funded his entire existence. He wanted me to apologize. He wanted me to kneel before the fake throne of the Sterling family. I slowly pulled my arm out of his violent grip. I reached down and smoothed the fabric of my expensive gown, making sure not a single crease was out of place. I looked at the man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed for, and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. "I am not apologizing to anyone," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "In fact, I am just getting started." I stepped away from him, leaving him standing in the shadows, and turned my attention toward the massive illuminated DJ booth at the front of the grand hall. The time for whispering was over. As I took my first step toward the front of the room, a waiter carrying a silver tray hurried past me. I smoothly reached out and picked up a crystal glass of deep red wine. My fingers wrapped around the delicate stem. I gripped it so tightly my knuckles turned white under the harsh ballroom lighting. For a brief second, the sheer fury coursing through my veins made me want to shatter the glass right then and there. But instead, I forced my muscles to relax. A slow, calculated half-smile spread across my face. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper. I was going to execute this flawlessly. Before I could make it past the massive ice sculpture in the center of the room, Richard Sterling himself blocked my path. The patriarch of the family stood tall, his silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that projected an image of untouchable wealth. He was flanked by two massive security guards wearing earpieces and dark suits. Richard looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He did not see a daughter-in-law. He did not see a successful woman. He saw a nuisance that was interrupting his carefully orchestrated display of power. Julian Richard barked, his voice booming over the ambient chatter and the string quartet. I understand your wife is having some sort of emotional episode, but I will not tolerate this loud, disruptive behavior at my daughter's wedding. We have state senators and Vanguard executives in this room. If she cannot offer a sincere apology to Penelope right this second, I am going to have my men physically remove her from the premises. Richard did not even wait for Julian to answer. He turned his cold eyes directly toward me, leaning in slightly so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. And while they are at it, Richard continued, his voice dripping with venom. I will have them take those 2 kitchen squatters you brought with you and throw them out the back service door where they belong. They have overstayed their welcome anyway. My heart pounded against my ribs, a steady, furious drumbeat. He was openly threatening to have his hired muscles lay hands on my elderly parents. I glanced over my shoulder and saw my father across the room quietly eating his dinner, completely unaware that the man hosting this party was currently plotting to drag him out like trash. Julian panicked entirely. The prospect of Richard Sterling being angry with him was too much for his fragile ego to bear. He lunged forward, stepping between me and Richard, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Sir, please, I am so sorry, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. She is just acting out. Zuri, please do not do this to me. Just say you are sorry to Penelope and Richard. Think about my career. Think about my position at the hospital. Think about my doctor's salary that pays for your entire lifestyle. Do not throw everything I have built away because you are too proud to know your place. That was it. That was the final straw. I turned my body fully toward Julian. I made sure my posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders back, my chin held high. I wanted every single person in our immediate radius to hear exactly what I was about to say. The surrounding guests had already gone completely silent, their eyes locked on our dramatic confrontation. Your doctor's salary, I repeated loudly. My voice rang out clear and sharp like a ringing bell, cutting through the heavy tension in the room. I let the words hang in the air for a second. Then I let out a sharp, mocking laugh that made Richard's eye twitch. Julian, did you forget who paid $250,000 of your medical school debt for 6 years? I asked, my voice rising in volume and power. Did you forget who worked 80-hour weeks running a business so you could parade around that fancy title just to impress people who secretly despise you? The silence that washed over the ballroom was absolute and deafening. Even the string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, the cellist halting his bow mid-note. Guests who had been pretending to engage in polite conversation suddenly snapped their heads in our direction. The elite Vanguard executives Richard had been trying so frantically to impress paused with their drinks halfway to their mouths, their eyebrows raised in shock. Julian's face turned a violent, unnatural shade of crimson. The color rushed to his cheeks and his neck, highlighting the absolute panic and humiliation taking over his body. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish, but no words came out. The polished, successful surgeon facade he had worked so hard to curate shattered into a million irreversible pieces right there on the marble floor. For years, Julian had told the Sterling family and everyone else who would listen that he was the sole financial provider in our marriage. He had painted me as the lucky dependent wife who got to stay home and enjoy the fruits of his grueling medical career. He used my quiet nature and my work from home schedule to build a lie that elevated his own status. And now his biggest, most pathetic lie was exposed under the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. Chloe, who had rushed over to see the commotion, let out a loud, dramatic gasp. She grabbed her heavy white wedding gown and pushed past a waiter to stand next to Julian. That is a total lie. Chloe sputtered, her face flushing red to match her mother Penelope's earlier expression. Julian is a top-tier surgeon. He told us he bought you that designer dress you are wearing. He told us he pays for everything in your life. You are just trying to humiliate him because you are insanely jealous of my family and our wealth. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, never taking my eyes off Julian. I savored the absolute terror radiating from his sweating forehead. I bought this dress, Chloe, I said calmly, my voice steady and unwavering. Just like I bought the luxury car he drove here tonight to impress your father. Just like I bought his way into the very career he is currently using to beg your family for a hospital promotion. Richard stepped forward, his face contorted in absolute fury. He hated being embarrassed in front of his peers. But more than that, he hated losing control of the narrative he had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to protect tonight. I have heard enough of these ridiculous psychotic lies, Richard sneered, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. He motioned aggressively to the two massive security guards standing behind him. Get her out of here immediately and go grab her parents from the back table. I want all three of them off my property this second before I call the local police and have them arrested for trespassing and harassment. The two guards stepped forward simultaneously, their large hands reaching out to grab my bare arms. But I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I simply shifted my gaze to the guard closest to me and gave him a stare so incredibly cold and authoritative that he froze in his tracks. If you put one finger on me or my parents, I said evenly, locking eyes with the guard, I promise you will be looking for a new job by tomorrow morning, and you will be facing a lawsuit that will drain every dime you have ever made. The guard hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. He looked back at Richard for confirmation, clearly unsure if he should risk grabbing a guest who spoke with such absolute, terrifying confidence. That brief moment of hesitation was all the time I needed. I placed my half-full wine glass onto the tray of a passing, terrified waiter. I turned my back on Richard, Chloe, and my trembling, humiliated husband. I had delivered the first strike, but I was nowhere near finished. I resumed my purposeful walk toward the brightly illuminated stage. Every step I took toward the stage felt like a steady drumbeat echoing in the cavernous room. The sharp click of my designer heels against the polished marble floor sliced cleanly through the ambient noise of the party. People literally stepped back to carve a path for me. The wealthy elites, the vanguard executives, the state senators, they all parted like the Red Sea. They had never seen someone discard the Sterling family authority with such blatant, fearless disregard. I kept my chin perfectly level. My eyes were fixed on the elevated platform where the DJ booth sat wrapped in cascading white orchids. I did not look back at Julian. I did not need to. I could feel his pathetic, collapsing presence fading behind me in the shadows. Halfway across the ballroom, out of the corner of my eye, I saw the second security guard. Richard had given him the signal. The massive man in the dark suit was walking aggressively toward the folding table near the kitchen doors, my parents' table. My father Thomas saw him coming. My father did not cower. He stood up slowly, adjusting the lapels of his navy suit, placing himself firmly between my mother and the approaching guard. My mother reached out her hand, resting gently on my father's arm. The guard raised his hand, reaching out to physically grab my father's shoulder. A surge of protective rage burned so hot in my chest, I thought I might breathe fire. Nobody touches my father. I doubled my pace. I did not run because running implies panic, and I was in absolute control of this room. I reached the curving glass staircase leading up to the entertainment stage. I gripped the polished mahogany handrail and ascended. The young sound operator standing behind the massive audio mixing board looked down at me with wide, terrified eyes. He was wearing a ridiculous velvet bow tie and giant headphones, completely oblivious to the massacre unfolding on the dance floor until this very second. He had a smooth, upbeat jazz track playing, providing a sickeningly cheerful soundtrack to the Sterling's bigotry. I stepped onto the platform. The young DJ took one look at the sheer determination on my face and instinctively took a step back, holding his hands up in a gesture of total surrender. I did not say a single word to him. I simply reached across the glowing expanse of the mixing board and slammed my hand down hard on the master mute button. The jazz music died instantly. The sudden suffocating silence that fell over the $500,000 reception was heavier than concrete. It was jarring. Conversations snapped shut mid-sentence. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. 500 faces turned simultaneously to look up at me standing on the illuminated stage. I reached out and pulled the sleek wireless microphone from its chrome stand. The cold metal grounded my anger, focusing it into a weapon. I looked out over the sea of confused, arrogant faces. I saw Chloe in her massive custom white dress, looking like a panicked ghost. I saw Julian covering his face with his hand, wishing the marble floor would open up and swallow him whole. And then I saw Richard Sterling. He was aggressively pushing his way through the crowd of his wealthy peers, his face a violent shade of purple, marching directly toward the stage. Cut the power. Richard screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with desperation and rage. He pointed frantically at the catering staff and the event coordinator standing near the wall panels. Cut the main electrical breaker right now. Do not let that woman speak another word. Security, get her off that stage and throw her out. The head event coordinator panicked under the billionaire's command. She sprinted to the wall and slammed her hand against the master electrical kill switch. The stage lights went pitch black. The glowing mixing board went dark. The wireless microphone in my hand gave a pathetic little electronic pop and died completely. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Richard stopped walking, a smug, victorious smile spreading across his face. He thought he had won. He thought cutting the lights and the sound would plunge me back into the dark where he believed people like me belonged. He thought he could silence me just by flipping a switch. He severely underestimated exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with. I smiled in the darkness. As the secret chief executive officer of a private equity firm that specialized in hostile takeovers, I never walked into a volatile situation without a contingency plan. Before I even approached the stage, my eyes had scanned the architecture of the room. I had noticed the venue's independent battery-powered emergency public address system mounted on the upper pillars. It was designed for fire evacuations and ran completely separate from the main entertainment breaker. I dropped the useless microphone onto the floor. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen, instantly opening a backdoor access application my tech security team had built for me. It was originally designed to override secure communication lines during intense corporate acquisitions, but it worked perfectly on outdated hospitality tech. Within 3 seconds, I paired my phone directly to the venue's emergency broadcast Bluetooth array. I tapped the microphone icon on my screen. I brought the phone to my mouth. "Testing," I said softly. My voice did not just play, it exploded. The emergency speakers mounted in every single corner of the massive ballroom projected my voice with deafening, crystal-clear authority. The sound bounced off the marble floors, rattling the crystal chandeliers, vibrating deep in the chests of every single person in the room. Richard's smug smile instantly melted into a mask of pure, unfiltered horror. He spun around, looking frantically at the ceiling, trying to figure out how I was still broadcasting in a dead room. The security guard, who was inches away from grabbing my father, froze in his tracks, terrified by the booming voice of the woman he had been ordered to physically assault. I stepped to the very edge of the darkened stage. The only light hitting my face was the pale moonlight filtering through the massive glass skylights above. I looked directly down at Richard Sterling, my eyes locking onto his terrified stare. "You can cut the lights, Richard," I said, my voice echoing like thunder across the silent room. "But you cannot silence the truth. You invited my family to this extravagant display of wealth just to hide them by the garbage. You wanted an audience to witness your power. You wanted to prove your superiority. Well, congratulations. You have my full attention. And now every single one of your distinguished guests is going to hear exactly what kind of empire they are buying into." The crowd was completely paralyzed. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I had the entire Vanguard executive board, the state politicians, and the Sterling family completely at my mercy. I looked over at my father, who was still standing tall by the kitchen doors, a proud, knowing smile finally breaking across his dignified face. He knew what I was capable of. I took a deep breath, letting the anticipation stretch the tension in the room to its absolute breaking point. I was ready to deliver the blow that would shatter the Sterling legacy forever. "Let us talk about the happy couple," I announced. My voice bounced off the walls and echoed into the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. I looked down from the stage directly at Chloe. My face was perfectly calm, a mask of total control. Contrast that with Chloe's face, which had completely drained of color. She looked terrified, her eyes wide and her jaw trembling. She gripped the layers of her custom white wedding dress so tightly her knuckles were white. "Derek," I said, shifting my attention to my brother-in-law. He stood frozen next to his bride, looking utterly lost in his expensive tuxedo. "You always were the naive one in your family. You thought you hit the jackpot. You thought this beautiful, wealthy woman from high society fell madly in love with you and invited you into her elite world. Did you even bother to read the prenuptial agreement her father forced you to sign yesterday afternoon in his private study?" Derek blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "It was just standard legal paperwork," he stammered, his voice barely carrying to the first row of tables. "Richard said it was just to protect their generational assets and keep the company board secure." "Generational assets," I repeated. I let out a sharp, cold laugh that pierced the heavy silence in the room. "Derek, they do not have any assets left. But I will get to the reality of their bank accounts in a minute. First, let us talk about what you actually signed your life away for." I tapped the screen of my phone, swiping past the audio interface to pull up a highly encrypted PDF file my team had extracted hours ago. "Section 4, Paragraph 12 of your prenuptial agreement," I read aloud, projecting every single syllable with perfect punishing clarity. "In the event of a divorce, which can be initiated by the Sterling family at any time without cause, Derek waives all rights to alimony, property, and capital gains. Furthermore, Derek agrees to surrender his voting rights on the Sterling Enterprise Board of Directors immediately upon the solemnization of this marriage." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd. Derek looked at Richard, a flash of genuine betrayal crossing his face. "But wait, it gets much better." I continued, refusing to give them a single second to recover their composure. Why would a supposedly billionaire family force a middle-class black man to join their board of directors just to legally strip him of his voting rights before the ink on the marriage license is even dry? I will tell you exactly why. Because Sterling Enterprise has been bleeding cash for 3 years. Because no private bank on the East Coast will lend them another dime. And because their absolute last hope for survival was a massive federal infrastructure grant designed exclusively for minority-owned or minority-led businesses. I paused, letting the heavy, undeniable reality of my words sink into the minds of the state politicians and Vanguard executives sitting at the VIP tables. I could see the exact moment the realization hit them. The senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they were attending a fraudulent event. The elite bankers began whispering frantically to one another, pulling out their own phones to message their risk management teams. "You see," I said, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. Richard Sterling realized his all-white good old boy board of directors disqualified him from the diversity compliance requirements needed to secure that vital government funding. He could not get the federal money. So he needed a prop. He needed a minority figurehead to slap on the company letterhead to fool the grant committee. And he found the perfect gullible puppet in my husband's little brother. Chloe burst into tears. It was a loud, ugly sound that completely shattered whatever illusion of grace she had tried to maintain all night. "Stop it!" she screamed, pointing a violently trembling finger up at the stage. "You are lying. You are making all of this up to ruin my wedding. Richard, please make her stop talking right now." "I am not ruining your wedding, Chloe," I replied smoothly, looking down at her weeping face without an ounce of pity. "I am ruining your business transaction. You did not marry Derek for love. You married him to secure a federal bailout for your bankrupt father. Your family literally brokered this marriage to meet a diversity quota. You put my parents next to the trash can tonight because you think you are superior, but you are the ones treating a human being like a disposable piece of compliance paperwork. Derek took a large step away from Chloe. He looked at her as if she had suddenly turned into a monster right in front of his eyes. He looked down at the massive gold wedding band he had just put on his finger an hour ago. Then he looked up at Richard, who was avoiding his gaze entirely, staring angrily at the floor. Is it true? Derek asked, his voice breaking with devastation. Am I just a compliance checkmark for your federal grant application? Richard opened his mouth to speak, likely to spin some elaborate manipulative corporate lie, but I cut him off instantly. I was the one controlling the narrative tonight. Of course it is true, Derek, I projected over the emergency speakers. Section 8, Paragraph 2 of your contract. Derek agrees to maintain the public image of a managing partner while receiving a fixed annual stipend of $60,000. $60,000. They bought your name, your race, and your dignity for less than what they spent on the floral arrangements in this room tonight. You are not a husband to them, Derek. You are a tax loophole. The Vanguard executives were practically out of their seats now. Nobody in the high-stakes financial world wanted to be associated with federal grant fraud. Richard saw his entire network of elite investors pulling away from him in real time. He looked like a man watching his entire life burn to the ground, helpless to stop the flames. This is corporate espionage! Richard bellowed, his face red with panic. He pointed a furious finger at me. She hacked my private legal documents. That is a federal crime. Someone call the police right now and have her arrested. Call them, I challenged, leaning forward into the darkness of the stage. Please, Richard, call the federal authorities. I am absolutely sure the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Grant Oversight Committee would love to have a close look at your fraudulent board structure. In fact, I would be more than happy to hand over all the unredacted documents myself. Julian was completely paralyzed. He stood at the bottom of the stage steps, looking back and forth between me and his brother. He had worshipped the Sterlings. He had verbally abused me and my parents just 30 minutes ago to defend the honor of these people. And now he was watching them be exposed as the ultimate parasites. His desperate desire to be accepted by high society had completely blinded him to the fact that they were literally purchasing his brother for parts. I did not let the momentum die. I had the Sterling family pinned against the wall, and I was going to deliver the final knockout punch. The marriage contract was just the appetizer. It was time to show the Vanguard executives the main course. I tapped my phone screen again, preparing to light up the massive projector behind me. Before I could hit the final button on my phone, a loud, piercing shriek tore through the heavy silence of the ballroom. It was Chloe. She had dropped to her knees right in the middle of the dance floor, clutching the sides of her head and sobbing uncontrollably. The elegant, supposedly high-class bride was now a tangled mess of expensive white tulle and smeared mascara. She was throwing a full-blown temper tantrum, slamming her fists against the polished marble, realizing her fake billionaire lifestyle was evaporating in front of her wealthiest friends. Richard lost whatever shred of sanity he had left. His corporate empire was crumbling, his daughter was wailing like a toddler, and his elite peers were looking at him with absolute disgust. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his face a mask of violent desperation. "Get her off that stage right now," he bellowed to the security guards. "I do not care if you have to break her arms. Drag that crazy woman out of my house immediately." The guards had hesitated earlier, but the direct, furious command from their billionaire boss shifted the energy in the room. They cracked their knuckles and took a heavy, menacing step toward the glass staircase. But it was not the security guards who reached me first. It was Julian. My husband scrambled up the illuminated glass steps like a cornered animal. The sheer panic in his eyes had been replaced by a wild, pathetic rage. He had built his entire identity around the validation of white, wealthy elites. Seeing them reject his brother and expose the family he worshipped completely broke his fragile mind. He did not care that I had just saved his brother from a fraudulent marriage. He only cared that his own social ladder had been kicked out from under him. He lunged across the stage floor. He did not aim for the phone in my hand. He aimed directly for my face. His right hand swung through the air in a vicious, desperate arc. I saw it coming a mile away. I stepped back smoothly, my heels planting firmly on the stage, letting his hand strike nothing but empty air. The momentum of his missed slap threw him entirely off balance, causing him to stumble awkwardly and crash his hip against the DJ mixing board. The crowd let out a collective gasp of horror. A husband attempting to strike his wife in front of 500 people was a line nobody expected the polished doctor to cross. Even Penelope Sterling covered her mouth in shock. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked him. I made sure my phone was positioned so the microphone caught my voice, projecting it loud and clear over the emergency speakers for the entire room to hear. Julian spun around, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You ruined everything," he screamed. His voice was frantic, desperate to appease the man glaring at him from the dance floor. Richard was going to make me the director of surgery next month. He promised me the position. And you come in here with your jealous, psychotic lies and destroy my career. He turned his back to me and looked down at Richard, practically begging like a beaten dog. "Richard, sir, please listen to me. I had absolutely no idea she was going to do this. She is unstable. She has always been jealous of your family and Chloe's beauty. She is just a bitter woman trying to ruin a beautiful night." Richard sneered, looking at Julian with absolute unfiltered contempt. "Control your wife, Julian," Richard spat out, "or I will make sure you never practice medicine in this state again." That threat was the final push Julian needed to completely abandon his marriage, his dignity, and his soul. He turned back to face me. His chest was heaving, his face contorted in a pathetic attempt to look powerful and authoritative. He puffed out his chest, trying to project the image of a strong man putting an unruly woman in her place. "We are done," Julian shouted. He made sure he was loud enough for Richard, Penelope, and the Vanguard executives to hear every single word. "I want a divorce, Zuri. I am filing the papers tomorrow morning. I will not be tied to a woman who disrespects the most important people in my life. You are nothing compared to the Sterling family. You never were. Pack your bags and get out of my house tonight." He thought his public declaration of loyalty would save him. He thought discarding his black wife to protect his white bankrupt masters would earn him a pat on the head and the promotion he so desperately wanted. He stood there on the stage, waiting for Richard to nod in approval. He waited for the wealthy crowd to take his side and applaud his decisive action. But nobody applauded. The Vanguard executives were whispering among themselves, looking at Julian with sheer disgust. A man who would sell out his own brother, attempt to physically assault his wife, and beg for a job in the span of 5 minutes was not someone they respected. He was not a leader. He was a massive liability. I looked at Julian, and for the first time in 8 years, I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. The heavy anchor I had been dragging was finally cutting itself loose. For years, I had quietly carried the weight of his insecurities. I had funded his lifestyle, paid off his massive medical school debts, and allowed him to play the role of the successful, wealthy provider. I did it because I believed in the vows we took. I wanted him to succeed. But tonight, he broke every single one of those vows. He proved that he would gladly throw me to the wolves if it meant he could sit at their table. "Your house," I repeated. My voice dropped to a deadly calm register that sent a chill through the room. "You mean the house that I paid the down payment for? You mean the house whose mortgage is currently paid by my consulting firm?" Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically, playing to his invisible audience. "Oh, please, Zuri. Stop lying to these people. Everyone here knows I am the doctor. I am the one bringing in the real money. Your little freelance business barely covers your expensive shopping habits. You are going to leave this marriage with absolutely nothing. I will make sure my lawyers take every dime you have." I let out a slow, deep breath. The massive projector behind me was still connected to my phone. I had planned to show the Vanguard executives the Sterling's loan defaults next. But Julian had just forced his way into the spotlight, and it would be incredibly rude not to give him the absolute destruction he so desperately craved. "You want to talk about real money, Julian?" I asked, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "Let us talk about it." I tapped my phone screen, bypassing the sterling corporate files I had queued up, and opened a different folder. This one contained the financial records I had pulled just hours before arriving at the wedding. Since my husband has graciously decided to initiate our divorce proceedings in front of 500 witnesses, I think it is only fair we do a quick division of assets right now, I announced. Julian crossed his arms, wearing a smug, arrogant smirk. "Do it," he challenged, completely blind to the trap he was stepping into. "Show everyone how much you depend on me." I tapped the screen. The massive projector behind me flared to life, casting a bright white light across the stage. A high-resolution image of a bank statement appeared, massive enough for even the people in the back rows to read clearly. It was a joint checking account statement. "That is our primary account," Julian said loudly, pointing at the screen. "Look at the deposits. Those are my hospital paychecks. I provide everything." I tapped the screen again. A second document appeared right next to the bank statement. It was a wire transfer receipt dated 3 days ago. It showed a transfer of $200,000, leaving that exact joint account sent directly to a private offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. The smug smirk vanished from Julian's face instantly. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost. He took a step back, his hands dropping to his sides. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I am a financial consultant. Julian," I said, my voice dripping with ice. "You really thought you could siphon our joint funds into a hidden account to buy a sports car without me noticing? You thought you could steal the money I put into that account to fund your ridiculous attempts to impress Richard Sterling?" The Vanguard executives murmured loudly. Stealing from a spouse to fund a lavish lifestyle was a terrible look. But I was not done. I swiped to the next slide. "And speaking of your prestigious medical career," I continued, projecting a new document onto the screen. It was a highly confidential email thread between Julian and the hospital administration board. "This is the real reason you are so desperate for Richard's help tonight. Because you are not up for a promotion at all." Julian lunged forward again, panicking, trying to grab the phone from my hand. "Turn it off, Zuri, please," he begged, his aggressive bravado completely shattered. But I stepped back out of his reach. "You are currently under internal investigation for malpractice and accepting kickbacks from pharmaceutical reps," I read aloud from the projected email. "The hospital board is preparing to suspend your medical license next week. You are broke, Julian. You are a fraud. And the only reason you have not been fired yet is because I have been quietly paying the hospital legal team to delay the proceedings." Julian fell to his knees right there on the stage. The reality of his situation crushed him. He had just publicly demanded a divorce from the only person who was protecting him from total ruin. He had alienated his brother, humiliated his wife, and exposed his own corruption to the most powerful men in the state. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The villain had dug his own grave, and I was more than happy to hand him the shovel. I stepped away from him, turning my attention back to the silent, stunned crowd, ready to finish what I started with the Sterling family. I stepped away from Julian, leaving him weeping on the stage floor. He was a broken, pathetic man, entirely consumed by the consequences of his own greed. He was no longer my concern. I turned my attention back to the dance floor, locking my eyes on Richard Sterling. The billionaire patriarch was frantically typing on his phone, his hands shaking violently. He was likely trying to contact his crisis management team or his offshore bankers, hoping the temporary distraction of my husband's public meltdown had bought him a few precious minutes to hide his remaining assets. It had not. I was about to drop an anvil on his glass house. I tapped the screen of my phone, closing the files that had just ended Julian's career. For a brief second, the venue's default video feed kicked back in. A sickeningly sweet, slow-motion video of Chloe and Derek running through a sunlit vineyard filled the massive screen behind me. It was the perfect visual representation of the lie the Sterling family was selling tonight. A beautiful, carefree illusion funded by deceit. I let it play for exactly 3 seconds before I pressed the final execution button. The romantic video violently cut out. The sudden flash of bright white light from the projector illuminated the entire ballroom. Then the screen filled with a massive high-definition financial spreadsheet. But there was no black ink on this document. The entire screen was bleeding in glaring, unavoidable red ink. The numbers were staggering. Row after row of negative equity, massive deficit margins, and outstanding loan balances that stretched into the tens of millions. I had completely bypassed their heavily doctored public records and pulled the raw, unedited internal audit from their private servers. "Look closely!" I commanded, my voice booming through the emergency speakers and vibrating in the chests of every person in the room. "Look at the real Sterling enterprise. Your old money elite facade has been bankrupt for 3 years. This very mansion, the one you are standing in right now drinking $100 champagne, has been mortgaged 4 times. Penelope Sterling let out a strangled gasp. Her hand shot up to clutch her diamond necklace, holding onto it tightly, as if the bank was going to repossess it right off her neck. Richard charged toward the front of the stage again, his face a mask of absolute panic. "Shut it down!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "That is fabricated data. She is a corporate terrorist. Turn that screen off immediately." But the Vanguard executives sitting at the VIP tables were not looking at Richard. They were staring intently at the massive projector screen. These were men who read complex financial reports for a living. They recognized authentic audit formatting, certified bank routing codes, and official foreclosure warnings when they saw them. The room grew so quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the projector fan spinning above us. "You thought you were invincible because of your last name," I said, pacing the very edge of the stage, towering over Richard. "But a legacy name does not pay back $40 million in unsecured commercial real estate loans." 3 years ago, Richard made a catastrophic bet on a luxury development project overseas. When the market crashed and the project failed, he did not downsize. He did not sell his assets to cover his losses. He was too proud. He was too obsessed with maintaining his image in high society. I pointed a finger directly at the screen, highlighting a specific row of red numbers that was large enough for the entire room to read. Instead of taking the loss he borrowed against his own company, I explained, breaking down the financial ruin piece by piece. He borrowed against his commercial properties. He took out predatory bridge loans just to pay the interest on his original loans. And when the banks finally cut him off, he did the unthinkable. He secretly mortgaged this historic family estate, not once, not twice, but 4 separate times through 4 different shell companies. Chloe looked at her father, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute horror. "Dad," she whispered, her voice carrying in the dead silence of the ballroom. "What is she talking about? Is this true? What about my trust fund?" Richard could not even look his daughter in the eye. He just stared at the floor, his chest heaving, his fists clenched at his sides. He had completely run out of lies. I tapped my phone screen, advancing the slide. A new document appeared in bright red. It was a finalized bank transfer statement. "Your trust fund was drained 18 months ago, Chloe," I stated coldly. "He used your money to pay off a single quarter of his corporate tax debt, so the federal government would not seize his corporate headquarters. You are entirely broke. You do not own this estate. You do not own the company. The only thing the Sterling family currently owns is $50 million of insurmountable debt." The lead Vanguard executive, a tall, imposing man who had been laughing and smoking expensive cigars with Richard just an hour ago, slowly stood up from his table. He threw his linen napkin onto his plate with a gesture of utter disgust. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Richard. "Richard, tell me this is a joke," the executive demanded, his deep voice slicing through the tension. Tell me you did not just invite my firm here tonight to underwrite a $50 million corporate bailout using collateral that has already been leveraged 4 times over. Richard opened his mouth to speak. He raised his hands, trying to summon the charming, persuasive persona he had used to navigate high society for decades. John, please, you have to listen to me, Richard pleaded, stepping toward the executive. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. We are restructuring. The federal grant will clear next month, and we will be entirely liquid again. You know I am good for it. The executive took a deliberate step back, refusing to let Richard come anywhere near him. You committed federal fraud to get that grant by using a fake board member, the executive said, pointing a rigid finger at Derek. And you tried to trick my bank into taking on your toxic radioactive debt. We are completely done, Richard. I am calling my risk management team right now. We are pulling every single line of credit your company has with us by midnight. The panic in the room was palpable. The illusion was completely dead. The wealthy elites who had populated the room hated nothing more than the stench of poverty, and the Sterlings were suddenly reeking of it. The other VIP guests began to stand up. Women were grabbing their designer clutches and wrapping their expensive shawls around their shoulders. Men were aggressively dialing their phones, whispering furiously to their brokers and lawyers, desperate to distance themselves from the Sterling enterprise fallout. Even the hired help realized what was happening. The waiters carrying trays of expensive caviar and champagne slowly stopped walking. The bartenders stopped pouring drinks. The 2 massive security guards who had been ordered to throw my parents out of the building suddenly took several steps back away from my father. They looked at Richard, then looked at the red numbers on the screen, realizing instantly that the billionaire who hired them was not going to be able to pay their invoices tomorrow morning. My parents remained exactly where they were by the kitchen doors, but their posture had changed. They were no longer trying to make themselves small. My father stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the elite, arrogant family that had insulted his wife and his daughter absolutely crumble to dust. I stood on the stage, the glowing red numbers of the Sterling family, ruin projecting a harsh light across my face. I had completely dismantled their empire. I had exposed their bigotry, their fraud, and their total financial collapse. But the night was not over yet. The police sirens were about to wail, and the true identity of the person who now owned their entire lives was finally about to step out of the shadows. I watched from the stage as a wave of absolute chaos washed over the room. State senators who had been eager to pose for photographs with Richard just an hour ago were now practically sprinting toward the coat check, desperate to avoid being associated with a sinking ship. The camera would have panned beautifully across the sea of panicked, wealthy faces, capturing the exact moment their polite high society masks completely slipped off. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a wildfire, growing louder and more frantic with every passing second. Wives were aggressively pulling their husbands toward the exit. Business partners were exchanging furious, terrified glances. But I was not quite finished with my presentation. I raised the heavy microphone back to my mouth. "Do not leave just yet," I commanded. My voice cracked like a whip over the emergency speakers, immediately halting the mass exodus. "You have all been invited to a show tonight, and it would be incredibly rude to walk out before the grand finale." I turned my body and pointed my index finger directly at Richard Sterling. He looked up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. The arrogant billionaire who had threatened to throw my parents out with the garbage was completely gone. In his place stood a pathetic, desperate con artist whose greatest trick had just been exposed. "Let us talk about the price tag of this little gathering," I said, pacing slowly across the illuminated stage. $500,000. That is what Richard Sterling spent to put on this event. $500,000 for imported White Orchid's vintage champagne beluga caviar and a custom designer dress for his crying daughter. Chloe looked up at me from the dance floor, her tear-streaked face twisting in confusion. She was still clutching the skirts of her ruined dress, desperately trying to understand how her perfect fairy tale had turned into a financial autopsy. "It is a beautiful wedding, Chloe," I said smoothly, looking right into her panicked eyes. But it was never actually about you. And it certainly was not about Derek. You did not invite these distinguished guests to witness a marriage. You invited them to a theatrical performance. This entire $500,000 evening is nothing but a gilded cover, a desperate, expensive stage play designed to deceive every single investor in this room. The remaining VIP guests stopped whispering and turned their attention back to the stage. They were hooked. I had their undivided attention. Richard took a weak step forward, raising his shaking hands. "Stop it," he pleaded, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. "Please, just stop talking. You have done enough damage." "I have not even scratched the surface." "Richard," I replied coldly. "Why would a man who is $50 million in debt spend $500,000 he does not have on a party? The answer is simple. He needed to look rich to catch a bigger fish. He needed you all to walk into this historic estate, drink his expensive wine, and believe that the Sterling family was still untouchable. He was using this wedding as a live marketing brochure to secure one final massive bailout loan." I looked out at the Vanguard executives who were still standing by their tables, their faces dark with fury. "Richard did not just want your money tonight," I told them. "Vanguard was just his backup plan. His real target, the only financial institution capable of absorbing his massive mountain of toxic debt, is a private equity firm called Apex Holding." The moment I said the name Apex Holding, Richard's knees visibly buckled. He stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of a VIP table to keep himself from collapsing onto the marble floor. His eyes widened in absolute shock. Apex Holding was a notoriously secretive, highly aggressive investment firm. Richard had kept his communications with them completely hidden, or so he thought. He could not comprehend how a freelance financial consultant knew about his most desperate confidential business strategy. "You invited the regional directors of Apex Holding to this wedding," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly. "You sent them front row invitations. You promised them a night of unparalleled luxury. You wanted them to look around this room, see the state senators and the banking elites, and believe that Sterling Enterprise was a thriving, incredibly profitable empire. You thought if you threw enough glitter in their eyes, they would blindly sign a check to save your entire company." Chloe slowly stood up from the floor. She ignored Derek, who reached out to help her, and walked directly toward her father. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of heartbreak and rage. "Is she telling the truth? Did you use my wedding day to pitch a corporate loan? Is that why you forced me to invite all these strangers I do not even know?" Richard could not answer her. He just stared at the floor, his face completely devoid of color. His silence was the only confirmation Chloe needed. She let out a devastated sob and covered her face with her hands, finally realizing that she was just another pawn in her father's fraudulent chess game. I looked at Julian, who was still kneeling on the stage a few feet away from me. He was staring at the Sterling family with a look of utter disgust. The people he had worshipped, the people he had literally destroyed his own marriage to impress, were nothing but cheap hustlers dressed in expensive suits. They had played him for a fool, and he had eagerly volunteered for the role. "You sent 7 different emails to the Apex Holding Acquisition Board last week," Richard Thuther said, citing the exact documents I had personally reviewed from the comfort of my home office. "You begged them for a meeting. You promised them unprecedented returns on their investment. You told them that your company was experiencing record-breaking growth, completely leaving out the fact that your own house was facing imminent foreclosure. You are not a billionaire, Richard. You are a beggar in a custom tuxedo." The absolute sheer audacity of it all was almost poetic. Here was a family that had looked down their noses at my parents. Penelope Sterling had sneered at my father, a man who had worked 35 years at the post office to provide a stable, honest life for his family. She had told me we smelled like manual labor. She had told me we did not belong in their high society. Yet behind closed doors, they were drowning in a sea of lies, desperately begging for money just to keep the lights on in their fake mansion. "You sat my parents next to the garbage tonight because you thought you were better than us," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that commanded total silence. You thought your white skin, your legacy name, and your stolen money made you superior. You thought you could humiliate us, and we would just quietly accept it. But you made a fatal miscalculation. You underestimated exactly who was sitting in this room. A loud rhythmic pounding echoed from the grand entrance of the ballroom. The heavy oak doors swung open with a violent crash. The flashing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated the dark driveway outside, spilling into the pristine marble lobby. 4 uniformed police officers marched directly into the reception hall, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Richard looked at the police officers and let out a manic, relieved breath. He mistakenly believed that the police he had called earlier to arrest me had finally arrived. He thought the law was here to save him, to drag the loud, angry black woman out of his house and restore his shattered peace. Officers! Richard yelled, his voice suddenly regaining a fraction of its former arrogant authority. Thank God you are here. This woman has hacked my private servers. She is trespassing on my property and causing a massive disturbance. Arrest her immediately. But the officers did not even look at me. They did not look at the stage. They marched straight past Richard, stopping just a few feet away from the VIP tables. They were not here for me. They were here because a massive financial crime had just been publicly broadcast to a room full of federal witnesses, and the real owners of the Sterling estate were finally ready to claim what was theirs. The heavy, rhythmic thud of police boots against the polished marble floor sent a physical vibration through the ballroom. The guests who just moments ago were the untouchable elites of the financial world scrambled out of the way, pressing their backs against the floral-draped walls. The sudden arrival of law enforcement shattered whatever fragile illusion of high society remained. 4 officers moved in a tight, disciplined formation, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, their eyes sweeping the massive, chaotic room. Richard Sterling saw the uniforms, and his entire posture transformed. The hollow, terrified man who had just been exposed as a massive fraud vanished. In his place, the arrogant billionaire patriarch miraculously resurrected himself. He adjusted the lapels of his custom tuxedo, took a deep breath, and marched directly toward the lead officer. He actually smiled. It was a smug, victorious grin that made my stomach turn. He genuinely believed that his wealth and his skin color gave him absolute authority over the law. "Officer, thank God you finally arrived," Richard announced, projecting his voice so the remaining Vanguard executives could hear him taking control of the situation. He stepped directly into the path of the lead officer, a burly sergeant with a stern, unreadable expression. "I am Richard Sterling, the owner of this estate." Richard continued, extending a hand that the sergeant completely ignored. "I am the one who called dispatch. We have a highly dangerous situation here. That woman standing on the stage is a disgruntled, mentally unstable individual who has unlawfully trespassed into my daughter's private wedding reception." The sergeant stopped walking, his eyes shifting from Richard to the massive projector screen behind me, which was still glowing with the red ink of the Sterling family loan defaults. "She is a corporate terrorist," Richard spat, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at me. "She has hacked into my highly secure, confidential private servers. She stole proprietary financial data, manipulated it to create forged documents, and is now broadcasting criminal defamation to my esteemed guests. I want her placed in handcuffs immediately. I want her phone confiscated as evidence of corporate espionage. And I want her and the 2 accomplices she brought with her removed from my property right this second." Richard crossed his arms, looking back at the wealthy guests with a smug expression, as if he had just heroically neutralized a bomb. He thought throwing around words like corporate espionage and trespassing would instantly trigger the officers to rush the stage and tackle me to the ground. He thought his legacy name was a magic spell that compelled the police to do his bidding. But before the sergeant could even respond to Richard's ridiculous demands, Julian inserted himself into the spotlight one last pathetic time. My husband scrambled across the dance floor, aggressively pushing past a stunned waiter to stand shoulder to shoulder with Richard. He was sweating profusely. His expensive suit wrinkled from his earlier fall on the stage, but his eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate need to please his wealthy masters. He wanted to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was a loyal servant to the Sterling Empire. Officers, please listen to Mr. Sterling. Julian pleaded, his voice cracking with anxiety. I am Dr. Julian, a respected surgeon at the city hospital, and unfortunately, this woman is my wife, or rather my soon-to-be ex-wife. I can personally attest to her unstable mental condition. A collective murmur of disgust rippled through the room. Even the wealthy elites who had looked down on me earlier were visibly repulsed by Julian's behavior. A man actively volunteering to help the police arrest his own wife to save face at a party was a level of cowardice that made people physically uncomfortable to witness. She has been acting completely erratic for weeks. Julian lied flawlessly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. She is insanely jealous of the Sterling family. She even stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from our joint checking account to fund this psychotic revenge plot. I am fully prepared to sign whatever statements you need. If you need me to authorize an emergency psychiatric hold to get her into custody, I will do it right now as a medical professional. Just please put the handcuffs on her, drag her out of here, and let us resume this beautiful evening in peace. Julian looked at Richard, offering a sickeningly hopeful smile, waiting for a pat on the back. He had just offered to falsely institutionalize me. He had crossed a line of betrayal so dark and unforgivable that it solidified my absolute lack of mercy. He was no longer just a terrible husband. He was an active threat, and he was about to be completely neutralized. I did not scream. I did not defend myself. I did not frantically explain to the police that Richard and Julian were lying. When you hold all the cards, you do not need to raise your voice. I slowly walked down the illuminated glass steps of the stage. My movements were deliberate, graceful, and entirely unbothered. A young catering waiter was standing frozen near the bottom of the stairs, holding a silver tray with a single untouched crystal flute of vintage champagne. He looked terrified, caught in the crossfire of a billionaire meltdown and a police raid. I offered the young man a warm, reassuring smile. I reached out and delicately picked up the champagne glass by its slender stem. I turned to face Richard Julian and the 4 police officers. I raised the glass slightly in a mock toast and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cold, crisp bubbles popped against my tongue. It was without a doubt the best glass of champagne I had ever tasted in my entire life. "Arrest her!" Richard barked, losing his patience when the officers did not immediately draw their weapons and charge at me. "What are you waiting for? I told you she is a hostile hacker. Look at her. She is mocking the law right in front of your eyes. Put her in cuffs before I call the police commissioner and have all of your badges stripped." Julian nodded vigorously, pointing at me. "She is dangerous. Grab her." The burly police sergeant slowly turned his head to look at Richard. His expression did not change. He did not look intimidated by the billionaire's threats. He did not look impressed by Julian's medical credentials. He reached down and unclipped a thick, heavy leather folio from his duty belt. He flipped it open, revealing a stack of official court-stamped documents. "Are you Richard Thomas Sterling?" the sergeant asked, his voice a deep, authoritative rumble that cut through Richard's hysterical shouting. "Of course I am." Richard snapped, his face turning red with indignation. "I just told you that. This is my estate." The sergeant nodded slowly. He did not look back at me. He did not ask for my name. He did not pull out his handcuffs to arrest the dangerous hacker Julian had just fabricated. Instead, the sergeant pulled the top document from his leather folio and shoved it directly against Richard's chest. Richard instinctively brought his hands up to grab the thick stack of paper, looking down at it in total confusion. "Richard Sterling," the sergeant announced, his voice projecting clearly across the silent ballroom. "You are hereby served with an emergency federal injunction and an immediate notice of foreclosure. As of 6 o'clock this evening, this property, along with all assets tied to Sterling Enterprise, has been legally seized by the primary lien holder due to massive unrectified commercial default." The champagne glass in my hand caught the light of the chandeliers as I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip. Richard stared at the legal documents in his hands, his mouth falling open in a silent scream of absolute horror. "This is a mistake," Richard choked out, his hands shaking so violently the papers rattled against each other. "This is my private residence. You cannot foreclose on a private residence at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. This is illegal." The sergeant stepped closer to Richard, completely invading his personal space, radiating an intimidating, immovable authority. "This is not just a residential foreclosure, Mr. Sterling. The document you are holding also contains a federal warrant for your arrest regarding the fraudulent manipulation of corporate assets to secure federal infrastructure grants. We are not here to arrest the woman on the stage. We are here to secure this property and take you into federal custody." Julian staggered backward, colliding heavily with a decorated dinner table. Silverware and crystal glasses crashed to the floor, but nobody paid any attention to the noise. Julian's jaw dropped as he stared at the police officers, finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of the situation. He had just publicly begged the police to arrest his wife, only to realize the police were acting on my behalf. He had tied his entire future, his career, and his dignity to a man who was literally seconds away from being placed in handcuffs. Chloe let out a piercing scream from the dance floor. She abandoned her ruined wedding dress and tried to run toward her father, but the other three officers immediately stepped forward, forming a physical barricade between the Sterling family and the exits. "Ma'am, please stay exactly where you are," one of the officers commanded, resting a firm hand on his belt. "Nobody leaves this room until we have secured the premises and verified the identities of everyone involved in the Sterling Enterprise Executive Board." I stood a few feet away, watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to throw my parents away like garbage. The Vanguard executives were completely silent, watching the billionaire they had once respected get stripped of his power in real time. Richard Sterling was no longer the master of the house. He was a trespasser in a home that now legally belonged to the very people he had forced to sit next to the kitchen. The silence following the police sergeant's declaration was suddenly broken by the heavy, authoritative sound of the main ballroom doors swinging wide open. The remaining guests already pressed tightly against the floral-draped walls to avoid the police officers parted even further. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy elites as two incredibly imposing figures walked through the grand archway. They wore impeccably tailored black suits that practically radiated raw, unyielding power. The taller man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze was William Vance, the global chief executive officer of Vanguard Bank. Beside him walked Marcus Thorne, the highly elusive and notoriously ruthless managing director of Apex Holding. These were not the regional bank managers Richard had been buying drinks for all night. These were the apex predators of the global financial food chain, men who could bankrupt a small country with a single signature. Richard Sterling was currently standing in the middle of a foreclosed mansion holding a federal arrest warrant that guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell. Yet the moment his eyes locked onto William and Marcus, a terrifyingly delusional wave of relief washed over his face. The human brain is incredibly skilled at denial when faced with total catastrophic destruction. Richard actually believed his saviors had arrived. He thought the Apex Holding director was walking through those doors to sign the bailout paperwork, hand him a $50 million check, and make the police officers magically disappear. Richard dropped the federal documents onto the polished marble floor as if they were nothing but junk mail. He aggressively shoved past the police sergeant. Surprisingly, the burly officer stepped aside and let the billionaire take a few steps forward, likely amused to see exactly how deep Richard was willing to dig his own grave. Richard extended both of his hands, pasting on a frantic, manic version of his signature country club smile. His eyes were wide and wild, his breathing heavy and ragged. "William Marcus, thank God you are finally here," Richard practically shouted. His voice echoed awkwardly in the dead silent room, sounding thin and desperately pathetic. "Please forgive this ridiculous scene. You have arrived at a rather chaotic moment, but I assure you everything is completely under control. We are just dealing with a minor localized security breach." Neither William nor Marcus raised a hand to accept Richard's eager greeting. They stopped walking, standing shoulder to shoulder, looking at the sweating billionaire with expressions of absolute freezing detachment. They left Richard standing awkwardly in the middle of the dance floor with his hands outstretched. The air around them grew instantly cold. Richard dropped his hands and swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. But he kept talking, desperate to control a narrative that had already been burned to the ground. "It is just a crazy black woman," Richard said, gesturing dismissively toward the illuminated stage where I stood. He leaned in closer to the two executives, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, completely ignoring the fact that my microphone was still actively picking up every sound in the room. "My son-in-law's estranged wife. She lost her mind, hacked some internal accounting documents, and called in a fake police raid. You know how these people get when they want a quick payout. It is a pathetic extortion attempt from a classless family. But my legal team is handling it right now. Shall we step away from this mess and go into my private study to finalize the Apex loan? I have the contracts ready for your signature, and I saved a bottle of my best scotch just for you two." Julian, who was still cowering near a broken dinner table, saw a final desperate opportunity to align himself with the absolute top tier of the financial elite. He scurried forward like a frightened rat, stopping just behind Richard's shoulder. "He is telling the absolute truth," Julian added eagerly, nodding vigorously at the two billionaires. "I am Dr. Julian, a respected surgeon. I am officially divorcing her as of tonight. She is mentally unstable and completely jealous of the Sterling family wealth. She stole money from my accounts to fund this elaborate prank. Please, gentlemen, do not let her psychotic episode ruin this beautiful corporate partnership." I stood on the glass steps of the stage, watching the two most pathetic men on the planet try to sell my sanity and weaponize my race just to save their own skin. I did not interrupt them. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of my champagne. The Vanguard regional executives, who had been sitting at the VIP tables all night, looked terrified. They were actively backing away, refusing to make eye contact with their global CEO, terrified that the radioactive stench of Richard's fraud would permanently stick to their own careers. William Vance, the global CEO of Vanguard, finally broke his silence. His voice was quiet, deeply refined, but it carried a lethal, crushing weight that made every single person in the room hold their breath. "A minor security breach," William repeated slowly. He slowly lowered his gaze to look at the federal arrest warrant lying on the marble floor next to Richard's expensive Italian shoes. "Richard, you are currently being detained by federal authorities for defrauding my bank out of $40 million. I did not come here to save you. I came here to personally ensure that Vanguard seizes every single asset tied to your fraudulent name, right down to the gold cufflinks you are wearing." Richard staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. The manic smile shattered completely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He turned his desperate, pleading eyes toward the other man. "Marcus," Richard gasped, reaching a shaking hand out toward the director of Apex Holding. "Marcus, please. You reviewed our portfolio. You know Sterling Enterprise is a legacy brand. We just need the bridge loan. Apex promised us a lifeline." Marcus Thorne adjusted his immaculate silk tie, looking at Richard with a level of absolute disdain, usually reserved for scraping something foul off the bottom of a shoe. "There is no bailout loan," Richard Marcus said smoothly, his voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. "We never had any intention of saving your crumbling empire. We only agreed to review your internal audits so we could legally verify your impending bankruptcy. Apex Holding does not rescue failing corrupt businesses. We buy their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, seize their physical assets, and liquidate them for our own profit. You invited us here to trick us, but we only came to inspect the property we just purchased." Richard's knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of a nearby chair to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The two lifelines he had bet his entire existence on had just wrapped themselves around his throat and pulled tight. His daughter Chloe was sobbing hysterically in the background. His wife Penelope had completely fainted, slumped over a chair, while her wealthy friends backed away from her. "But you replied to my emails," Richard stammered, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "The Apex Acquisition Board said they were deeply interested in a partnership. You explicitly wrote that Sterling Enterprise had a very bright future under new ownership." "We did write that," Marcus replied coldly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sterling Enterprise does have a very bright future under new ownership. The structural assets are quite valuable once we remove the corrupt executive board currently running them into the ground. But I am not the one who makes the final acquisition decisions for Apex Holding. I simply manage the day-to-day corporate operations." Richard looked completely lost his mind, frantically trying to piece together a puzzle that had already destroyed him. "Then who is the chief executive officer?" Richard begged, looking frantically around the room, as if a mysterious, benevolent savior was hiding among the catering staff or the police officers. "Let me speak to your boss, Marcus. Let me explain the situation face to face. I can make this profitable for everyone. I just need 5 minutes with the owner of Apex Holding." Julian nodded enthusiastically right beside him, completely oblivious to the rapidly approaching execution. "Yes, please," Julian chimed in. "Just let us talk to your boss. We can clear up this entire misunderstanding right now." Marcus Thorne did not answer Richard immediately. Instead, his cold, calculating eyes shifted away from the ruined billionaire. He looked directly past Richard, past the sweating, pathetic figure of my soon-to-be ex-husband, and focused his attention entirely on the illuminated stage. William Vance followed his gaze. The two most powerful men in the American financial sector completely ignored the frantic babbling of Richard Sterling. They stepped around the billionaire as if he were an irritating puddle on the floor. They walked with purposeful, synchronized strides directly toward the center of the room. The crowd watched in absolute stunned silence as the Vanguard CEO and the Apex director moved away from the VIP section entirely. They were heading straight for the back of the room. They were heading toward the flimsy plastic folding table located right next to the swinging kitchen doors. The synchronized sound of their leather shoes hitting the marble floor echoed like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of the Sterling legacy. William Vance and Marcus Thorne did not spare a single glance for the state senators or the regional banking directors, who were practically climbing over each other to get out of their way. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, pulling back in absolute terrified silence. Richard Sterling remained frozen in the center of the dance floor. His outstretched hand, which he had offered in desperate greeting just moments ago, hung trembling in the empty air before falling limply to his side. He turned his body slowly, his eyes wide and vacant, watching the two billionaires walk away from him. They bypassed the towering floral centerpieces. They walked past the grand multi-tiered wedding cake. They left the brightly illuminated VIP section entirely behind. The lighting grew visibly dimmer as they approached the back of the hall. The air here was cooler, drafty from the constant opening and closing of the heavy kitchen doors. A few catering waiters, sensing the massive shift in gravity within the room, stopped moving entirely, peering through the circular glass windows of the kitchen doors to watch the impossible scene unfold. My father Thomas saw them coming. He did not look surprised. He did not look intimidated. He slowly stood up from his cheap, wobbly plastic chair. He reached down and calmly buttoned the front of his modest navy suit. He stood with his shoulders pulled back and his spine perfectly straight, projecting a quiet, unshakable dignity that no amount of old money could ever purchase. My mother, Helen, remained seated. She simply crossed her hands in her lap, her emerald green gown glowing softly in the dim light. She looked at the two most powerful men in the American financial sector with the serene, gentle authority of a queen holding court in exile. William Vance and Marcus Thorne stopped exactly 3 feet away from the flimsy folding table. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure building in the room. The wealthy elites, the people who had sneered at my parents all evening, leaned in closer, their minds unable to process the image forming right in front of their eyes. Then it happened. The bow that shattered a century of racist classist prejudice. Marcus Thorne, the ruthless managing director of Apex, holding a man known for tearing down corporate empires without blinking, lowered his head. He bent his waist in a deep, undeniable gesture of profound respect. Beside him, William Vance, the global CEO of Vanguard Bank, a man who routinely made federal politicians wait for hours in his lobby, mirrored the exact same motion. The two apex predators of the financial world bowed deeply to a retired postal worker and a former nurse. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman," Marcus Thorne said. His voice was not projected over the emergency speakers, but the room was so incredibly silent that his words carried all the way to the front of the stage. The title struck the crowd like a physical blow. "Mr. Chairman." "Good evening, Mrs. Helen." William Vance added, his tone dripping with absolute deference. "It is an immense honor to see you both again. I sincerely apologize for the deplorable conditions of your seating arrangements tonight. Had we known the Sterling family would subject you to such blatant disrespect, we would have accelerated the foreclosure proceedings by several hours to spare you the inconvenience." My father offered a warm, polite smile. "It is quite all right, William," my father replied, his voice calm and steady. "My wife and I actually found the view from back here to be incredibly educational. You learn a great deal about a man's true character by watching how he treats people he believes are beneath him." The Vanguard regional executives sitting at the VIP tables collectively paled. The blood drained from their faces as the horrifying reality crashed down on them. They had spent the entire evening laughing with Richard Sterling, drinking his champagne, and completely ignoring the black couple seated next to the garbage bins. They now realized that the man sitting at the folding table was not just an unwanted guest. He was the chairman. He was the invisible hand that controlled Apex Holding, the entity that had just swallowed Sterling Enterprise whole. He was a man with enough capital to buy and sell every single person in the VIP section before breakfast. Penelope Sterling, who had briefly regained consciousness in her chair, let out a weak, strangled gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head as the full weight of her own arrogant bigotry crushed her. She had walked over to that table earlier. She had told my mother that the Vanguard High Society was not accustomed to people who mispronounce wine names. She had told them they smelled like manual labor. She had told them to know their place. And now the highest-ranking Vanguard executive in the world was bowing to the very woman Penelope had called a peasant. The poetic justice was so absolute, so devastating, it literally made Penelope faint for a second time. Richard was completely broken. He dropped to his knees right there on the dance floor. The tailored fabric of his expensive tuxedo pooled around him on the marble. He stared at the back of the room, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His brain could simply not reconcile his ingrained prejudice with the undeniable truth standing in front of him. He had built his entire identity on the belief that his white skin and legacy name made him inherently superior. He believed wealth only looked one way, spoke one way, and belonged to one specific bloodline. The realization that a black family had quietly, legally, and effortlessly purchased his entire lineage out from under him absolutely destroyed his mind. He was not just bankrupt, he was conquered. And then there was Julian. My soon-to-be ex-husband was still gripping the edge of the broken dinner table to keep himself upright. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. He had spent 8 years of our marriage acting ashamed of my parents. He had constantly belittled their modest lifestyle, mocking my father's postal pension and my mother's nursing scrubs. He had literally begged the police to arrest me just 30 minutes ago, publicly declaring his divorce, to prove his loyalty to the Sterlings. Julian looked at my father, the chairman of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. Then he looked at me standing powerfully on the illuminated stage. He finally understood the magnitude of the mistake he had made. He had not just thrown away a loving wife, he had aggressively alienated himself from a dynasty of unimaginable wealth and power, all to secure a pat on the head from a family of bankrupt frauds. The promotion he wanted, the elite status he craved, the respect he begged for it, had all been sitting right in his own living room for 8 years, and he was too blinded by his own self-hatred to see it. Marcus Thorne stood back up straight, pulling a sleek leather-bound folder from inside his suit jacket. He handed it respectfully to my father. "Mr. Chairman, the asset transition is complete," Marcus reported with clinical efficiency. "The federal authorities have secured the perimeter. The primary bank accounts have been frozen and transferred to Apex Control. The property deed for this estate is now officially registered under your private holding company. What are your orders regarding the current occupants?" My father did not even look at the folder. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Richard Sterling, who was still kneeling pathetically on the floor. My father did not gloat. He did not scream or hurl insults the way Richard had done. True power does not need to raise its voice. "I believe the party is officially over," my father said simply. "Let the authorities do their job. As for the catering staff, please ensure they are all paid double their contracted rate for dealing with this unfortunate mess. They work hard for their money, and they deserve to be compensated properly." William Vance nodded immediately. "Of course, Mr. Thomas. It will be handled right away." My father turned his attention back to the front of the room, looking past the stunned crowd, past the Vanguard executives, and past the sobbing bride. He looked directly up at me standing on the stage. For the first time all night, his stoic expression broke into a wide, incredibly proud smile. He gave me a single approving nod. It was the silent acknowledgement between a father and a daughter, confirming that the trap we had carefully set together had finally snapped completely shut. I smiled back at him. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the Sterling estate had been completely sterilized. The fake royalty had been dethroned, and the real owners of the house had officially taken their seats. I stepped away from the edge of the stage, leaving the glowing red numbers of the financial ruin projecting behind me, preparing to deliver the final devastating blow to the man who had broken my heart. I lifted the microphone back to my lips for the very last time. The ballroom was so incredibly quiet that you could hear the gentle mechanical hum of the massive projector still illuminating the stage behind me. The screen was still bleeding with the red ink of Richard Sterling's financial autopsy, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the dance floor. My eyes swept across the room, gliding past the terrified Vanguard executives, past the weeping bride in her ruined dress, and locked directly onto Richard. He was still kneeling on the marble floor, a broken, hollow shell of a man, his expensive tuxedo pooling around him like a deflated parachute. Richard I said, my voice cold, absolute, and echoing relentlessly through the emergency speakers. "You spent this entire evening parading your supposed superiority. You thought your legacy last name granted you permanent immunity from the consequences of your own catastrophic business failures. You looked at my parents, two incredibly hardworking, dignified Black people, and you saw nothing but the ugly stereotypes you have blindly clung to your entire life. You thought they belonged next to the garbage. You thought they were completely beneath you." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the room stretch out. The Vanguard executives and state politicians were holding their breath, their eyes darting between me on the stage and my parents standing quietly at the back of the hall. "But let me educate you on how real wealth operates in the modern American economy," I continued. "Real wealth does not need to throw $500,000 weddings with money it does not possess just to keep up appearances. Real wealth does not need to belittle others to feel powerful. Real wealth is silent, it is calculating, and it is incredibly patient." I looked down at the sleek wireless microphone in my hand. I did not need the venue's emergency broadcast system anymore. I had the undivided, paralyzed attention of every single soul in the building. I let my fingers open. The heavy metal microphone slipped from my grasp and hit the stage floor with a loud, definitive thud. The sound cracked through the cavernous hall like a judge's gavel delivering a final, inescapable sentence. Apex Holding, I said, projecting my natural voice with every ounce of strength and authority I possessed in my lungs. The private equity fund you have been frantically begging for a bailout. The corporation you thought was run by faceless white billionaires who would inevitably rescue your decaying dynasty. Apex Holding is 100% owned by my family. A collective audible gasp ripped through the VIP section. The state senators and banking elites stared at me in total paralyzed shock. The logic of the American economy had just been violently flipped on its head right in front of them. My parents. I continued my vision narrowing as I stared Richard down, my eyes turning into razor-sharp daggers. The retired postal worker and the former nurse. The people you mocked. The people your wife said smelled like manual labor. The people you tried to throw out the back door. They are the sole financial architects who quietly bought up every single piece of your toxic radioactive debt. Richard stared up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and completely vacant. His brain simply refused to process the information. He opened his mouth, his jaw trembling violently, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped in a nightmare he had built with his own two hands. While you were busy taking out predatory loans to fund your country club memberships and your private jets, my parents were quietly acquiring commercial real estate. I explained, driving the final nails into his coffin. They did not buy flashy sports cars. They did not buy designer clothes to impress people they hated. They built a massive anonymous private equity fund that specializes in acquiring the distressed assets of arrogant bankrupt tycoons who are too foolish to realize their era of dominance is permanently over. You thought you were the master of the universe, Richard, but you are just another bad investment that my family decided to liquidate. The Vanguard executives process the brutal logic perfectly. Men like William Vance understood the ruthless reality of modern financial warfare. Anonymous shell companies and shadow funds were the new apex predators of the global market, and the fact that a brilliant, wealthy African-American family had masterfully used the system to legally devour an openly racist old money institution was a terrifying display of absolute dominance. The executives looked at my father with a new profound sense of terror and respect. They knew that the man standing by the kitchen doors could wipe them out just as easily as he had wiped out the Sterlings. Chloe Sterling, still kneeling in her massive custom wedding gown, looked up at me. Her perfect manicured world had been completely annihilated. The trust fund she bragged about, the estate she flaunted, the elite status she wore like a crown, it all legally belonged to my mother. The very woman Chloe had insulted and tried to hide from her distinguished guests. Chloe let out a long, devastated wail, finally understanding that she was nothing more than a trespasser in my parents' house. And then there was Julian. I shifted my gaze to my soon-to-be ex-husband. He was practically crawling on the stage floor, his expensive suit ruined, his face smeared with sweat and terrified tears. He had always hated his own background. He had always felt inferior to the white elites he surrounded himself with. He had literally begged to divorce me just to prove his loyalty to a man who now owned absolutely nothing. Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a register of pure, unadulterated pity. You spent the last 8 years chasing a seat at a table that was actively rotting from the inside out. You were so desperate for Richard's approval that you gladly sacrificed your own wife, your own brother, and your own dignity. You wanted to be part of the 1% so badly. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at his pathetic, trembling form. Well, you were married to it, I told him. The generational wealth you worshipped was sleeping right next to you every single night. But you were too blind, too insecure, and too prejudiced against your own people to ever see it. You traded a billionaire heiress for a front-row seat to a bankruptcy hearing. Julian let out a gut-wrenching sob. The sheer magnitude of his mistake crushed him with the weight of a collapsing building. He reached a shaking hand out toward me, his fingers trembling in the air as if he could somehow pull me back. Zuri, please, he choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed in the silent room. I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know. Please forgive me. I love you. We can fix this. I will take back the divorce. I was just stressed. I will do whatever you want. Please do not leave me like this. I looked down at him with absolute freezing disgust. I did not feel an ounce of heartbreak. I did not feel any lingering affection. I just saw a parasite that had finally been detached from its host. You do not love me, Julian, I said evenly. You love the power you just realized I have. But you are never going to touch a single dime of it. You filed for divorce in front of 500 witnesses. You admitted to stealing $200,000 from our joint accounts. You are going to face a massive civil lawsuit, the total revocation of your medical license, and you will walk away from this marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back. You chose your side tonight. Now you get to die on it. Julian collapsed, completely pressing his forehead against the cold glass steps of the stage, weeping uncontrollably. He had destroyed his entire life in less than an hour, all because he wanted to impress a room full of people who were currently watching him cry with absolute disgust. I turned my back on him. I did not need to say another word. The screen behind me was still glowing red. The police officers were moving in to place Richard Sterling in handcuffs, and the Vanguard executives were quietly slipping out the side doors, desperate to escape the fallout. The $500,000 wedding had officially become the most expensive funeral in corporate history. I walked gracefully down the stairs, keeping my head held high, ready to reunite with the two most powerful people in the room. As I reached the bottom of the glass staircase, the remaining romantic ambiance of the ballroom was violently erased. One of the police officers had located the main electrical panel on the far wall. He bypassed the gentle dimming switches and threw the master breakers. Rows of harsh, blinding security lights flooded the grand hall from every angle. The soft golden glow of the $500,000 wedding was instantly replaced by the unforgiving clinical glare of an active crime scene. The sudden burst of light exposed every ugly detail in the room. The spilled wine looked like bloodstains on the white tablecloths. The melting ice sculptures looked like deformed monsters. And the wealthy elites looked like panicked animals caught in a trap. William Vance, the global CEO of Vanguard Bank, paused at the grand archway before making his exit. He turned his silver head, his piercing gaze locking onto Richard, who was now being pulled to his feet by two armed officers. For the official record, William announced, his voice carrying easily across the scrambling crowd. Vanguard Bank formally withdraws any and all pending partnership agreements with Sterling Enterprise. Furthermore, our legal department will be handing over all your forged loan applications to federal prosecutors by tomorrow morning. We are entirely severing all ties. You are completely on your own, Richard. William did not wait for a response. He turned and walked out the door, taking the last shred of the Sterling family hope with him. Marcus Thorne looked at my father, waiting for the final corporate command. My father gently placed his hand on my shoulder, yielding the floor to me. I looked directly at the broken billionaire. And as the primary shareholder of Apex Holding, I declared, making sure the police dashboard cameras outside and the remaining guests inside heard every single word. I officially reject your application for emergency restructuring. Your commercial assets are frozen. This foreclosure is active immediately. The financial death sentence is final. You have absolutely nothing left to sell. The police sergeant raised his radio to his shoulder, calling for additional transport units to block the estate exits. He then turned his attention to the crowd of terrified billionaires and politicians. Ladies and gentlemen, this property is now under federal seizure. The sergeant barked, his voice echoing off the marble walls. The wedding is over. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises before my officers begin locking down the perimeter. Anyone remaining inside after that time frame will be charged with trespassing on a federal crime scene. Total panic erupted. The distinguished Vanguard executives, the state senators, and the old money elites abandoned all pretense of high society grace. Survival instincts kicked in, and the wealthy crowd turned on each other. They shoved past one another, trampling over fallen floral arrangements and crushing expensive crystal glasses beneath their designer shoes. The coat check in the lobby became a literal battleground of wealthy women screaming at terrified attendants to find their furs. Men in custom tuxedos sprinted down the massive gravel driveway, desperately dialing their private drivers, terrified that a local news crew might arrive and photograph them fleeing a raided estate. The valet parking station was pure chaos, with luxury cars honking aggressively as the elite guests fought to escape the radioactive stench of the Sterling bankruptcy. Chloe Sterling was caught right in the middle of the stampede. The guests she had tried so incredibly hard to impress were now pushing past her as if she were completely invisible. She stumbled backward, disoriented, and sobbing, her heavy custom white wedding gown catching on the jagged edge of an overturned dinner table. She tried to pull away, but the thick silk snagged on the exposed metal. With a loud, violent tearing sound, the entire side of her pristine dress ripped wide open. Delicate lace, imported tulle, and hundreds of hand-sewn pearls scattered across the dirty marble floor. Chloe dropped to her knees amidst the ruins of her fairy tale. She clutched the torn fabric to her chest and buried her face in her hands, letting out a raw, agonizing scream that was entirely ignored by the fleeing crowd. She had no honeymoon to go to. She had no trust fund to fall back on. She did not even have a home to sleep in tonight. Her husband, Derek, did not rush to comfort her. He simply stood a few feet away, looking at the ripped dress and the crying woman, realizing he had almost chained himself to a sinking ship just to be a diversity prop. He quietly took off his tuxedo jacket, draped it over a chair, and walked out the front door without looking back. The harsh security lights finally roused Penelope Sterling from her second fainting spell. She slowly opened her pale eyes, blinking frantically against the blinding glare. She was slumped in a chair near the VIP section, her expensive silver gown wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. The very first thing she saw was a police officer aggressively wrapping bright yellow crime scene tape across the heavy oak doors of her private dining room. The second thing she saw was her husband. Richard Sterling was having his hands wrenched roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed loudly over the sounds of the fleeing guests. No, Penelope shrieked. Her voice was brittle, high-pitched, and entirely hysterical. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping over her own expensive heels. "You cannot do this! We are the Sterlings. We are a legacy family. We belong here. You cannot kick us out into the street. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight?" A female police officer stepped directly into her path, holding up a firm, unyielding hand. "I suggest you call a cab out of here, ma'am," the officer replied coldly, completely unfazed by the wealthy woman's tears. "Because you do not live here anymore, and if you interfere with a federal arrest, you will be leaving this estate in the back of a squad car right next to your husband." Penelope covered her mouth, her eyes wide with unimaginable horror. She looked at Richard silently, begging him to fix it, to use his power to make the police go away. But Richard could not even look at her. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in total defeat as the officers began marching him toward the grand entrance. The billionaire patriarch, the man who had ordered my parents to be thrown out like garbage, was now being paraded through his own living room in handcuffs. As Richard was led past the back of the hall, he was forced to walk directly past my parents. My mother and father did not gloat. They did not say a single word. They simply stood there, radiating calm, untouchable dignity. Richard kept his eyes glued to the floor, too ashamed to look at the black family that now rightfully owned the very ground he was walking on. The caterers and the waitstaff, realizing that the arrogant family who had been treating them terribly all night was finally getting what they deserved, stopped packing up the food. A few of them actually pulled out their phones, recording the glorious moment Richard Sterling was shoved into the back of a flashing police cruiser. I walked over to my parents. The massive ballroom was nearly empty now, save for the police officers securing the exits and Marcus Thorne standing quietly nearby. The deafening noise of the fake high society had vanished, leaving behind a profound, peaceful silence. Are you ready to go home? My father asked, his voice warm and steady. I looked at the yellow crime scene tape sealing the doors. I looked at the ruined wedding cake and the torn pieces of Chloe's dress scattered on the floor. I thought about Julian, who had likely run off into the night with absolutely nothing to his name. The trap had worked perfectly. The empire was dismantled. The financial death sentence had been carried out to the absolute letter. Yes, I smiled, linking my arm through my father's on one side and my mother's on the other. I am ready to go. We have a lot of new real estate to manage on Monday morning. My parents and I turned away from the ruined ballroom, leaving the flashing police lights and the shattered crystal behind us. We walked slowly through the grand arched hallway toward the massive front foyer of the Sterling estate. The chaotic sounds of the wealthy guests trampling each other to escape the property echoed faintly in the background, providing a deeply satisfying soundtrack to our departure. The air in the foyer was cooler, uncorrupted by the suffocating perfume and panicked sweat of the Vanguard executives. We were just 10 feet away from the heavy oak front doors, ready to step out into the crisp night air and leave this nightmare behind forever. But before my father could reach out to push the doors open, a frantic, desperate weight threw itself onto the polished marble floor directly in our path. It was Julian. He had followed us out of the ballroom, but he was not walking. The man who had spent the last 8 years obsessing over his perfect posture, his tailored suits, and his carefully curated image of high society success, was now literally dragging himself across the floor like a wounded animal. His expensive tuxedo jacket was gone. His silk tie was torn loose, hanging haphazardly around his neck. His face was slick with cold sweat, his eyes bloodshot and swollen, and his cheeks were streaked with terrified, uncontrollable tears. "Zuri, wait, please wait," Julian gasped. His voice was a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze that barely sounded human. He reached out with violently trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my designer dress. My father did not hesitate. He immediately stepped forward, positioning his body directly between Julian and me. My father stood tall, his shoulders broad, casting a long shadow over the pathetic man trembling on the ground. "Do not touch my daughter," my father commanded. He did not yell. He did not need to. His voice carried the absolute terrifying authority of a man who could legally and financially erase Julian from the face of the earth with a single phone call. Julian flinched backward as if he had just been struck by lightning. He pulled his hands back to his chest, looking up at my father with a mixture of profound terror and devastating realization. This was the man Julian had relentlessly mocked for years. This was the retired postal worker Julian had allowed Penelope Sterling to humiliate and banish to a table by the garbage cans. And now Julian fully understood that he was looking up at the chairman of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. "Mr. Thomas, please, sir, I am so incredibly sorry," Julian sobbed, pressing his palms flat against the cold marble floor. "I was blind. I was so stupid. I let Richard manipulate me. I was terrified of him. I just wanted to be successful so I could provide a good life for your daughter. I wanted to make you proud of me." I gently placed my hand on my father's arm, silently thanking him for his protection, and stepped around him so I could look directly down at my husband. I looked at the man I had loved, the man I had sacrificed years of my life to support, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. The anger was gone. Only clinical disgust remained. "Do not dare insult my intelligence by blaming Richard Sterling for your own cowardice, Julian," I said smoothly. "You did not do any of this to make my father proud. You did this because you hated yourself. You hated where you came from, and you were desperate to erase your own identity. You wanted to impress a room full of arrogant racists so badly that you were willing to throw your own family into the fire." Julian shook his head violently, tears dripping off his chin and pooling on the marble floor. "I panicked, Zuri. I swear to God I panicked. I thought they had all the power. I did not know you were Apex Holding. I did not know your family owned everything. If I had known we were billionaires, I never would have said those terrible things. We are a team, Zuri. We are partners. Please just give me one more chance. I will spend the rest of my life making this right. I will get on my knees every single day and worship you. Just please do not leave me like this. I stared at him, marveling at how a man could be highly educated yet so fundamentally stupid. If you had known I was a billionaire, you would have stayed quiet, I repeated slowly, letting the absolute toxicity of his own words hang in the air. That is exactly the problem, Julian. You are not loyal to me. You are only loyal to power. A marriage cannot survive when one person is constantly looking for a richer master to serve. You stood on a stage 30 minutes ago, tried to physically strike me in the face, and publicly begged the police to arrest me. You offered to have me committed to a psychiatric ward just so Richard Sterling would give you a promotion. Julian clamped his hands over his ears, sobbing louder, desperate to drown out the reality of his own unforgivable actions. But I was not going to let him hide from the truth. I reached into my designer clutch. My fingers bypassed the heavy titanium black card I had used to humiliate the banquet manager earlier. Instead, I pulled out a sleek, folded legal envelope. I had prepared this document days ago, long before I ever stepped foot into this fraudulent wedding reception. I held the envelope out, relaxing my grip, and let it drop from my hand. It fluttered down gently and landed right between Julian's trembling knees. "What is this?" Julian choked out, staring at the thick linen envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "Those are the divorce papers you so publicly demanded on the stage," I replied calmly. "My legal team filed the preliminary injunctions on Friday afternoon. Our marriage is legally over. And because you explicitly violated the morality and financial fidelity clauses of our prenup, by siphoning $200,000 into a Cayman Islands offshore account, you are walking away with absolutely nothing. You do not get the house. You do not get the cars. You do not get a single dime of alimony." Julian let out a raw, guttural wail. He scrambled to pick up the envelope, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the paper. "No, no, Zuri, you cannot do this. You cannot just throw me away into the street. I am a doctor. I have a prestigious career to maintain. We built a public life together. How am I supposed to survive?" "You do not have a career, Julian," I reminded him, my voice dropping to a register of pure surgical detachment. "Did you forget the highly confidential emails I just projected to the entire Vanguard executive board? You are under active federal investigation for medical malpractice and accepting illegal kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives. You have been stealing money and endangering the lives of your patients just to fund your fake luxury lifestyle." Julian looked up at me, his eyes wide with a new localized terror. "But your firm, your lawyers, they were handling it," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You said your legal team was going to make the hospital board drop the investigation. You promised me you would protect my medical license." "I was protecting my husband," I stated coldly. "But my husband stood on a stage tonight and declared he was divorcing me to impress a man who is currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser. I no longer have a husband to protect." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes, so he could understand the absolute finality of his destruction. "At 8 o'clock tonight, right when we arrived at this pathetic party, and you told me to keep my mouth shut, I sent an automated email to the hospital administration board," I explained. "I formally withdrew all legal and financial backing from your defense case. I terminated the retainer for the defense attorneys. And I also forwarded the hospital board the wire transfer receipts, proving you embezzled funds to hide offshore. They are holding an emergency disciplinary meeting on Monday morning. They are going to permanently revoke your medical license and hand your files over to the district attorney for criminal prosecution." Julian gasped, his chest heaving rapidly as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the grand foyer. The reality of his situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. He was not just losing a wealthy wife. He was losing his freedom. He was losing the prestigious doctor title he had built his entire arrogant identity around. "You are going to prison," Julian, I said, delivering the final, inescapable truth. "And when you finally get out, you will have no money, no medical license, and no high society friends to save you. The elites you worshipped tonight watched you humiliate yourself. They watched you get exposed as a thief and a fraud. They are going to pretend they never even knew your name. You traded a lifetime of genuine love and unimaginable wealth for a seat at a table that did not even exist. He collapsed entirely. He dropped the divorce papers, pressed his forehead against the cold marble floor, and wept with a level of absolute despair that was almost uncomfortable to witness. He was completely broken, hollowed out by the consequences of his own grotesque ambition. He had gambled his entire soul and he had lost everything. I did not feel sorry for him. I felt nothing but the profound, liberating lightness of a woman who had finally cut a massive toxic anchor from her life. I turned away from his trembling body, looking back at my parents. My father offered a small, reassuring smile. He reached out and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The cool, crisp night air flooded into the stifling, corrupted mansion, washing over my face and clearing my lungs. We walked out into the night together, our heads held high, leaving Julian sobbing on the floor of a foreclosed estate, completely surrounded by the ruins of the fake empire he had sacrificed everything to join. The heavy oak doors closed behind us, with a satisfying, definitive thud, cutting off the sounds of Julian's pathetic sobbing and the chaotic dismantling of the Sterling estate. The cool evening breeze immediately wrapped around us, carrying the clean scent of pine trees and the damp earth of the manicured lawns. It was a sharp, wonderful contrast to the suffocating perfumed toxicity we had just left behind. I stepped down the wide stone staircase, my heels clicking firmly against the pavement. I reached out and linked my right arm through my father's, then looped my left arm securely through my mother's. As we walked down the long, sweeping driveway, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the towering oak trees in rhythmic bursts of color. But we did not look back. We did not need to see Richard Sterling being shoved into the back of a squad car, or Penelope weeping on the curb, or Chloe mourning her ruined wedding dress. Their destruction was complete, and their fake, arrogant world was entirely behind us now. We walked forward with our heads held high, bound together by an unbreakable foundation of genuine love, mutual respect, and quiet, undeniable power. The greatest lesson I learned tonight was not about corporate acquisitions or leveraged debt. It was about the absolute necessity of recognizing your own inherent value, especially when the world tries to convince you that you have none. The Sterling family looked at us and saw only what their narrow, prejudiced minds allowed them to see. They saw retired working-class Black people. They saw a woman they thought they could easily intimidate and control. They attempted to define our worth by shoving us into a dark corner next to the garbage cans, expecting us to simply shrink down and accept the disrespect because of their legacy name. They spent $500,000 trying to project an illusion of invincibility, completely unaware that true power does not need a stage, a spotlight, or a VIP section to prove its existence. We did not need to wear our bank account balances on our sleeves. We let our actions do the talking. Human worth is never defined by the seat someone else tries to assign you. Your value does not diminish simply because an arrogant, insecure person refuses to acknowledge it. When people try to push you into the shadows, you do not have to cry, and you certainly do not have to beg for a seat at their rotting table. You simply wait. You build your strength in the dark, and when the time is right, you buy the entire building and rewrite the rules of the room. My 8-year marriage to Julian taught me the devastating cost of seeking validation from toxic people. He was so desperate to be accepted by high society that he gladly compromised his morals, his career, and his own family. He became a prisoner of his own insecurities. Establishing firm, uncompromising boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Cutting off Julian and the Sterlings was not just a financial transaction. It was the surgical removal of a poison that had been threatening my peace for years. You cannot build an empire, whether it is a financial portfolio or a happy life, if you allow parasites to drain your energy. As we reached the end of the gravel driveway, my father's private driver stepped out of a sleek black luxury sedan, holding the rear door open for us. I looked at my parents, seeing the quiet pride shining in their eyes. We had walked into a trap designed to humiliate us, and we walked out as the undisputed owners of the board. The sweet aftertaste of this revenge was not born from malice, but from the simple, beautiful execution of absolute justice. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to violently enforce your boundaries against people who thought you were weak? Share your story in the comments if you have ever turned the tables on those who look down on you. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more of the sweetest revenge stories.